So here's an interesting question that's worth having a look at concerning deform rigging and how we can deal with certain things in the pelvis and buttocks region. What we have here is one of the rig structures from Rigit version 1, and one of the cool little tricks that was implemented there were these pelvic hold bones, which we can see here in cyan. These help to hold up geometry around the pelvic region, and they mediate their motion in a couple of ways. First of all, we have this hips root that lets us swing the hips from side to side, and you can see that in this instance the bones there hold up a halfway structure in between. But also they work with the spine, so that when the first spine joint is rotated, they counter-rotate back against it a little bit to again hold up the geometry in this area. However, crucially, notice that when the legs themselves are turned, they do not go along. And this of course reveals the kind of hold that they're trying to create. Your pelvis does not collapse in when you're moving around from the hip, when you are pivoting your leg at the hip, and so they hold up the geometry in that case. But you do get squashing and flexing when you're standing still and just pivoting your spine from its base. And of course when you're swinging your hips or swinging your pelvis, then you need to hold up the deformation to account for that action. What we also have in the Rigit 1 rig are these bones here. Let me just enlarge this guy here so that it can be seen a little more clearly. This is a buttocks bone and is a slightly different hold structure that again works against the hip swing there, but also of course recognises the movement of the leg itself at the hip point to try and hold the buttocks geometry in shape. So the question then is, how can we replicate these kinds of structures using the Rigit 2 system? So here we've got just a basic biped rig, and of course we have the old hip swing on this fellow here. And of course he has a spine also there. So we'll pop into fitting mode, just hide the markers and the planes there momentarily. And what we want is a hold that works between the hip and the spine. So we select the first spine joint there. We select the hip here, and we'll just add in a hold pair. There we go, there's our little hold structure created for us there. We'll just pop it into approximately the same place as we saw in the Rigit 1 rig and hit rig fit. What we see of course is that when we rotate this first spine joint, that hold structure is going along nicely. It's also acting when we are using the hip root to swing the whole hips. The problem though, because it's linking straight onto this joint, which is the actual hip's pivot point, is the fact that when the leg moves side to side, then it also creates an action there, which is undesirable. So we'll get rid of that hold and we'll look at how else we can do it. One way of doing it is to add a spacer at the hip's position. This gives us this little spaced out system there, where we have this intermediary spacer bone running across the joint. What we can then do is select the first spine joint and this spacer joint, and we create our hold to act between those two joints. So there's our new hold. Let's pop that in there and go to rig mode. We see that the action is still present when using the hip swing. It is still present again when rotating the first spine joint, and crucially when the leg moves side to side, the action is either killed off or minimized massively due to the lesser rotation at this point here, the spacer point. Another way to think about it is that it would be good if you could just have a single static joint in here, which still followed the hip swing, but which was not following the action at the actual hip joint controller itself. So here with my basic preset, I'm actually going to select that first leg and clear part. So that gets rid of the legs there, and I'm going to add a new pair of legs, but I'm going to add a girdle to them. So we add our pair of legs there, which are coming off of course the hip's root, and what we wind up with is a pair of legs that have a girdle, just like a shoulder girdle or collarbone. Now ordinarily, certainly in humanoid bipeds, this isn't a structure that you really want or need to use. But of course you can create it and choose not to use it. Just so as I don't make such a mistake when animating, I will of course use the rigging toolbox here to just hide away those controllers so that they're never seen. But what this means I can do now is I can take my first spine joint there, I can take the girdle joint and I can add the hold so that it respects the motion of those two joints. When we go into rig mode then, what we have of course is this pelvic hold structure that works with the hip swing. It works with the spine rotation, but it is static under movement of the leg, irrespective of whether we have a spacer joint at this hip point or not. And so in either of those two ways, we can quickly and easily create a hold structure there in the pelvis that mirrors what we had in Rigid 1. So how about the buttocks then? Well, pretty much a similar thing. I'm going to select the girdle joint here, and I'm going to select the actual hip rotation joint there. And if you were using a spacer, that would be the second joint down, the one at the end of the spacer, and I'll add my hold there. Here it is. Let's just pop that into an approximate buttocks position like that. Drag it out so that we can see it, and we will rig fit. We see that it holds firm with the pelvis when we're swinging, just like in Rigid 1. And it also gives us this intermediary hold when the leg is moving back and forth like this to hold up a buttock structure, as well as allowing us to then further manipulate that buttock via the Deform controller. The other way that we could set up a buttock would be in fact to use the muscles, however, rather than a hold. So what I'll do is I'll select in this case the girdle joint and that actual hip rotate point again. You could perhaps, if you were wanting, come off the main root and go to the hip. That would also function perfectly well. And what I'm going to add is I'm going to choose the gluteus naming. I'm going to use, I think here I'll use a 2-piece muscle, and I'll just add in a pair there. Bingo, our little muscle part appears like this. We shall rotate it into position somewhere around here and bring the mid marker back there so as we're actually rounding out our muscle into the shape of the buttock. Let's just make it quite big, shall we? Nice big butt. And thus when we go into rig mode, we now have this butt muscle structure stretched across between our actual hip area and the leg itself, with the result that when the leg is moving around, there is our butt squishing and stretching to, of course, hold up the buttock area with this nice scaling muscle control. And of course, we have these controls that we can grab to further manipulate the buttock geometry as we see fit when we are animating. So there we go, a few extra tips on using holds and muscles and spacers around areas of the hip to try and create the kind of precise deformation structures that we're looking for in a given character.